Okay. Here with Richard Grant. Richard, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, you're welcome, Duncan. What are we going to talk about?
I was hoping we could talk about you. Um, I had heard about you the first time that I really got to know you as like a personality and a writer. Was actually through that BBC documentary you did, The American Nomads.
Right, right.
You went all around the Southwest, and you mentioned when you were younger, you said something like your grand ambition was to spend as many nights as possible sleeping in the dirt. Uh,
Yeah, I wanted to be a dropout when I was younger. I wanted to be just kind of a dirtbag, and was quite successful at that. And then fell into writing as a means of supporting that lifestyle. And then over the decades, I spent less nights sleeping in the dirt and more days sitting at my desk.
is that just a function of growing older, or how does it, I mean, do you wish that you were still sleeping in the dirt?
I miss it sometimes, but I think I have got older and more mature, and life changes and throws things your way, and I think that was a good way to live in my 20s and 30s. But I'm not sure. I wasn't committed to it as a lifelong practice.
Yeah, so I had heard when because obviously you're from England, and I heard that
Yes.
when you were younger, you saved up some money, you got to New York, and then something happened where you came to New Orleans and you had to be homeless for a few weeks. What happened there?
Yeah, I thought I was friends with this guy. I'd been sort of hanging around with him. He'd been taking me to parties, and then I went back to my motel to, I think, get a fresh pack of cigarettes from the carton, and he bashed me over the head with a brick
Oh my God.
and stole all my money and passport and ID and everything. It was traveler's checks back then. And so I was homeless for about 2.5 weeks in the French Quarter, and I would spend my days at the Marriott Hotel using my British accent to pose as a hotel guest, and would just kind of lay there by the pool. But at night I was sleeping in the Marriott parking lot, and
Wow.
then but I also, since I didn't have any money, um, I kind of started hanging around with the other homeless people, and they kind of taught me how to get food and get Mad Dog 2020 wine, and I kind of got to know
Wow.
them, and just basically, for lack of a better option, that was the lifestyle that I was stuck in until I could kind of make my arrangements. And then while I was lying there by that pool as a supposed hotel guest, I started writing letters back to friends of mine in London about the kind of scrapes that I'd been getting into. And one of my friends had started working for a magazine. He said, "Look, if you clean this up a bit, we can publish it and pay you some money." And that's really how I got started as a journalist.
Wow. So that
So it
you
was
kind
kind
of
of like the
started.
traveling came first, and then the journalism became a way to keep traveling, and then over the years the journalism kind of took over, and I became more of a writer than a traveler.
Um, American Nomads. That was your first book,
Yeah.
correct? How did that come about? Was that just a collection of your experiences up to that point?
Well, yeah, I'd led a very footloose life. I remember I worked out I'd never spent more than 3 consecutive weeks under the same roof for about 5 years. And during my travels in the American West, I would come across these other groups of modern nomads, contemporary nomads, rodeo cowboys, retirees in their RVs, kind of just drifters. I rode the freight train, so I kind of met that crowd, and I was keeping notebooks the whole time, and there was a lot of stuff in my notebooks that just wouldn't fit into the magazine stories that I was writing. And so I was wondering what to do with all this material I had, and then the idea came to me, well, I could write a book about these nomadic subcultures in the American West, and I tried to do that, but it just didn't hang together. Each chapter was too separate. So then I decided to introduce myself as a means of binding all these stories together.
Hmm.
So somewhat reluctantly, I started using the I word, but it proved effective as a technique to bring all these stories together. At least there was one character running through the whole book, which was me. And then I also looked into the history of wanderlust in North America, and I kind of wove that in too. Yeah, it's hard work, that first book, because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, but I mean, how many years did you spend working on that first book?
I spent, I mean, really working on it, I spent probably 15 months.
Okay.
But then I would run. I mean, but it wasn't contiguous. I mean, I had a small advance from a publisher, but I kind of blew through that. So then I would have to leave the book aside and go off and find a magazine assignment to make a little more money to live on, and that would buy me more time to work on the book. So it was just financially difficult. So I never had any money in those decades.
What? So I guess I'm trying to understand. I get the romantic vision of never sleeping under the same roof, of being like a wander. I get wanderlust as a concept, but so few of us like act on it. So I mean, was there something like in your upbringing, or like were your parents like encouraging of this, or I mean, how did you get like uh, the gumption to go through with this?
Um, I mean, I was born in Malaysia. I spent part of my childhood in Kuwait. I then got to London. I was told, well, this is where you're from, but it was completely unfamiliar to me. So I'm not really rooted anywhere. And I just had very strong restlessness. I just wanted to get out of England and find somewhere bigger and less class bound and less rainy. And I just always felt claustrophobic in England. And then once I reached those big spaces in the American West, it just kind of felt it just felt good, and it felt natural just to kind of stay on the move. I guess I was able to, and I wanted to, and there was nothing stopping me, especially once I started selling stories.
Right. That's the people that you're running.
I was always also knew exactly what I didn't want to do with my life, which was some kind of 9 to 5 thing. So
Hmm.
that was powerful.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really wants to do that, even if it's, I mean, something
Well, I mean,
that happens.
there's a choice you make between you know, freedom and security, and or money and being broke, and I choose to be kind of broke and free rather than secure and having money. I mean, it's different now. Now I have a kid, and I'm desperate for money and security. But in those, for my 20s and 30s and most of my 40s, I was very much what mattered to me was the idea of personal freedom. How much of it could you find in the modern world? I mean, it was never going to be perfect, but I was just kind of on this experiment to see how much freedom you could actually experience. And it seemed like wide open spaces and were a good place to do that.
At one point, while you're going through the Southwest, you went to Slab City, which is a temporary autonomous zone. It's basically like an anarchist area. Did that place strike you as any kind of utopia, or did you what, what kind of vibe did you pick up there?
I mean, it was kind of scruffy and sad. It didn't strike me as a utopia, but it did strike me as an interesting kind of political construct. It's very rare that you find a functioning anarchy in this world, and they do have to be temporary. And the people there kind of understood this, and I can't say I particularly enjoyed being there, but I kind of respected what they'd done there. They just weren't people that had a lot in common with. They were just, you know, there's a lot of I just it was just kind of too drugged out for me, frankly,
Mm.
and kind of too hippied out. But I respected them for having created that little anarchy there in the desert. I'm not sure it's still there. Maybe it is.
I think there's something, at least I had seen on Google. There are people still going down and doing it. I don't know if it's in the same form.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is when we talk about this wanderlust and, as you put it, the choice between freedom and security, and how you have a family now. Um, there's something, at least I think it's a human impulse, but it's definitely a very prominent American impulse. This person who's just wandering on the road, and a very strong individualist bent, but that individualism also sometimes can shade into like anti-society type behavior. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of the people I wrote about in that first book of mine, American Nomads, were virulently anti-society, and I kind of sympathized with them. And when I was young, it just seemed like society was a racket and a scam, and you gave your life to it in order to enrich some boss at the top of the system, and
Mhm.
it just didn't seem worth engaging with. It just at that age, it just seemed like a kind of a lousy racket that I didn't really want to have anything to do with. Um, Got to understand. I mean, I came of age in 1970s England, and punk rock was a formative influence. And the basic idea of punk was that the whole thing was rotten and needed to be gotten rid of. And I kind of carried some of that with me in my youth.
I see. That's and then there have been other places that you've gone to, like the Sierra Madre, for instance.
Yes, yeah, the Sierra Madre in Mexico. I mean, that was kind of journalistic curiosity more than anything. I was living in southern Arizona, right near the border, and there's this 900-mile long mountain range that kind of begins on the other side of the border, and it's only got two paved roads. There's a Native American tribe still living in caves. There was guys panning for gold there with riding around on mules. This is in the 21st century. And I just became intrigued that this kind of forgotten Wild West was sitting on America's back doorstep. And I wanted to go and write about it. And people said, oh, it's too dangerous. You can't go there. They grow, I mean, the economy of the Sierra Madre is growing drugs for us, basically.
Right.
They grow a lot of opium and a lot of marijuana, and they land a lot of cocaine in small planes. But I thought there must be a way to travel there. And I set out on this journey to try and travel the length of the mountain range and see what was going on in there. And it worked pretty well, and until it went wrong, and then I nearly got killed.
When did it go wrong?
Well, the way that you travel in the Sierra Madre and in most lawless places is entirely on the strength of your personal introduction. I mean, I think it's the same in like Afghanistan and parts of Africa. It's like you need someone to vouch for you, and they have to vouch for you with their life. And so I'd gone several hundred miles down the mountain range. Basically, it was like a game of pass the gringo. It's like, this gringo's okay. He's my friend. I will pass you down to the next valley. My cousin lives there. He'll look after you. And so that's how I'd been traveling. And then my chain of connections ran out, and but then I heard there was this new tourist resort in Durango, and they promised horse riding and fishing, and I went up there by myself, and it turned out to be half built, and there was two guys who just kind of looked at me like a pork chop had landed on their plate, and they were tipping out big piles of cocaine on their hands and eating it and drinking heavily, and they kind of toyed with me for a while, and then ended up basically hunting me. I was like hunted through the woods at night there. I was very, very lucky to get out alive.
Wait, so what happened? You go there and they're doing coke and they're drinking, and then they
Well,
just
okay.
turn on
What's
you, or
Yeah, I mean, the guy, I knew. Here's the moment when I knew I was in trouble. It's that this is all in Spanish. I'll say it in English, but I got up there and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a writer. I heard there was a new resort here." And they said, "You mean you're here alone and unarmed?" And I said,
Oh,
"Yeah, I'm alone and unarmed." They said, "Aren't you afraid someone's going to kill you?" And I said, "Well, why would anyone want to kill me? I'm harmless." And the guy said, stared at me. He's got this cowboy hat with a silver scorpion affixed to the side of it. Stares at me. He said, "To please the trigger finger."
oh my God.
And I was just like, this chill ran through me, and I was like, "Oh, how am I going to get out of here?"
So what? How did you get out of there?
Well, I couldn't just leave because there was bandits on the road that I'd come into, but the bandits came out at night, so I'd heard. So I didn't want to just jump in my truck and split
Right.
because of the bandits on that road. So I tried to make friends with them. I brought out a bottle of scotch, tried to kind of do the macho Mexican bonding thing. That kind of worked, and then it kind of didn't work. Then they kept threatening me. And then they tried to charge me a huge amount of money to stay in this half-built cabin. And then eventually they said, "Well, you can just there was another guy there. He kept telling me to watch out, and he said, "Well, just put your sleeping bag down in the trees there." And I knew they were going to come for me, so I set up a fake camp, and then I kind of went into the woods, and sure enough, they came with trucks and other guys and guns and flashlights looking for me. And I basically ran and hid and crossed this river and climbed up a hill into these rocks, and then they pitched a camp near my truck, and they stayed up drinking around a campfire for 3 or 4 hours. I was just shivering in the mountains waiting for them, hoping they would go. They didn't go, but they did fall asleep. And then once they fell asleep, I snuck down there and snuck into my truck and turned the key in the ignition, and there was an awful moment where that didn't catch, and then the second time it did, and I just roared past them. They were kind of coming out of their blankets, and yeah, that was my last night in the Sierra Madre. I haven't been back since.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
I mean, I
really miss Mexico though.
Have you gone back to Mexico since?
Yeah, I have been back to Mexico, but it's just so sad what's been happening there. I mean, more people were killed in Mexico last year than since the revolution, which was the most violent revolution of the 20th century. Yeah, I think I forget the number. I mean, 60,000 murders last year. It's hard to just hang out in the cabana and pretend it's not happening.
Right. Yeah, it's the college spring break retreat is not at all a glimpse of reality down there.
No, and I just know too much about it to I'm just horrified by the violence down there. I mean, I love Mexico, and I just hate to see what's happening to it.
Do you think if these drugs were just legalized, that a lot of the violence would go away?
That's an interesting question because, I mean, I think basically yes, but then as I've seen in Mexico, what happens when a drug dealer goes out of business? Like it would periodically happen in the Sierra, like the army would come through and they would cut down the guy's drugs, and he no longer had a way to make a living. And so they turned to kidnapping frequently or banditry. It wasn't like they were, enrolling in architect school or something. So there's a problem. Like, well, what do narcos do if they can't make a living through drugs? What are those guys going to do? Are they going to go into other sorts of crime? Are they going to go straight? I suspect they're going to go into other forms of crime, but I do believe in the legalization of drugs.
Have you when you're doing any of these like travels, have you tried any like ayahuasca or any like strong psychedelics like that? I mean, because you kind of, when you talk about introducing like the I into your writing to make a common thread, you almost strike me as like a much less self-destructive version of Hunter Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, I've not done ayahuasca. I have, have quite a history with the LSD and mushrooms and psychedelics, but haven't done any of that hardcore rainforest stuff. Yeah, I mean, the question is, do you put it in your writing? I mean, I'm not. I wouldn't call myself a drug lover, but
Right.
I enjoy them from time to time, and it seems honest and perhaps interesting to write about those drug experiences that you might have in the course of your the experience that you're writing about. I mean, I think, yeah, Mexico. I just did cocaine. I mean, that was what was around, but I had a rule that I would try and only do cocaine with cops, because that was my first experience down there when I was on that trip. Is that I was with a bunch of cops in a cantina, and they chopped me out a line of cocaine to see what I would do, and so I snorted it up
Oh, wow.
for reasons of personal safety.
Of course, yeah, you got to do it at that point.
It's like
What
it would have been very tricky not to do it.
you think they wouldn't have trusted you at that point?
Yeah, I mean, also just like turning down a drink in the Sierra Madre, or the more certain other parts of Mexico. I mean, it's a big country with many different regional cultures, but like some parts of the north, it's extremely rude to turn down a drink.
You
And
can't
it's the
just
same.
say
It's
I'm
the
in
same
AA.
with cocaine.
Wow,
It's like you're insulting the man's hospitality.
that's so fascinating. So it's just that common down there.
Yeah, I mean, I would go to these villages where there was no running water, no electricity, but there was tons of cocaine, and it was the grandmothers who would kind of deal the cocaine a lot of the times. The cocaine would come in, and because the bigger drug traffickers, instead of paying cash, they'd say, "Oh, we'll give you cocaine for your marijuana crop or your opium crop." So they had cocaine, and they had machine guns. That was the other thing. No running water, but they've got AK-47s and cocaine, and they've got alcohol, and it's a very volatile combination.
Oh, of course. Did any of these guys like go off when they were under the influence?
Yeah, I mean, the murder rate is astronomical. I mean, the leading cause of death for a man there is homicide, and a lot of it is just that volatile mixture of cocaine and alcohol and AK-47s and no law.
How does that compare to a place like East Africa?
I felt way safer in East Africa than I did in the mountains of Mexico, even though I had a few hairy moments, but it's just not as violent. Yeah, it's not as volatile. It's not as jumpy. It's not it's just not as violent. I mean, there's bandits. We got we were going down this river. I mean, we got stuck between like two poaching gangs with bullets flying overhead. But at least where I was in East Africa, it didn't feel nearly as dangerous as Mexico.
Is there any concern on your part when you're going there? I mean, you don't want to just be like like the white guy who's peeking out on African culture and writing some, especially like the English, like, oh, the English explorer checking out the natives, like, which your book Crazy River does not strike me that way at all. But I mean, how do you?
Well, good, because that's my horror.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
No, I mean, the reason why I went into these places was journalistic curiosity. It wasn't to kind of have an adventure.
Mm.
A little bit in the Sierra Madre it was. I'd just come out of a bad divorce and was feeling particularly reckless, and but
Oh,
certainly,
interesting. I didn't know that part.
yeah. I was kind of willing to just sort of like hurl my life into the mix and see what happened. But I mean, it just struck me that he was this Wild West sitting on America's back doorstep, and no one had ever written about it. It's like the internet was up and running. You would type in Sierra Madre, and like nothing would come up.
Yeah.
I was like, this is like an opportunity. This is something that needs writing about. It's an extraordinary place that no one has written about. And it was the same thing in Africa. I found out there was this Malagarasi River, the second biggest river in Tanzania. No one had ever gone down it in a boat before, and no one had ever written about it. You'd Google it, Malagarasi River, and there'd be like one fish study and like a little annotation in an explorer's diary from the 19th century. Like nobody knew what was down there. That was very intriguing to be able to, the word exploration is tainted with colonial legacy, but the idea
Yes.
of being able to go somewhere in the world that is not in our knowledge systems and find out what's happening there and write about it, I found that very intriguing.
You interviewed the president of Rwanda. What was your
Yes,
impression of the guy?
a lot smarter than I was.
Really?
Yeah, he's very, very. Uh, I mean, he's. I don't know how much you know about Paul Kagame, but it's a complicated story. But he's basically he's managed to fashion a role for himself in Rwanda, where he's kind of like a darling of the NGOs because he makes aid projects work, and there's not much corruption, and there's like a lot of women in the parliament. He ticked a lot of boxes for the Westerners. But he's got like some ungodly skeletons in his closet. He came to power through ending the genocide against the Tutsis, his people. But meanwhile, he conducted a secret genocide against the Hutus in Rwanda and in the Congo and managed to kind of more or less cover that up. It's coming out now. And he presents himself, we believe in democracy, free and fair elections, but his political opponents have a habit of showing up with their heads cut off. And I think he's probably into his fourth term now with getting sort of 95% of the vote. I mean, he's an operator, and I'd never been in a room with someone like that before, who was, I just felt like kind of a moron in there. He just had like so many levels of deceit and intelligence and secrecy going on, and was so polished on the exterior.
I mean, that's when you say like the levels of. I mean, do you feel like you were being played anyway?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I was writing for I wrote about it in my book, but I was also doing a profile of him for the Daily Telegraph in England, which is how I got the access. And he wanted to get his message out that the West should keep the aid money coming to Rwanda, and that he was building a model society there, which in some ways he is. I mean, Rwanda is spotlessly clean. They've banned plastic bags. Everything works really well. If you've come from some of the more chaotic parts of Africa, it seems miraculous how well the country works. But there's this. Have you got an incident over there?
It's some ambulance going by, but
Okay.
I think we're good now.
Okay.
As long as you're talking, it won't pick up.
Rwanda is it functions well. It's clean. It's orderly. No one is committing genocide, but there's this heavy undercurrent of fear that comes out of the Kagame's despotism.
That's I have a friend who spent some time there, and his impression was that the country in many ways was run like a dictatorship, and like the way people were being forced to sort of get over the legacy of genocide was that people were just being forced sort of to get along, and that eventually whatever conflict there was could just be washed over by the march of time. Does that seem accurate to you, or was this guy just like a dictator? Or?
Yeah, I mean that does seem accurate to me. I mean he is a dictator. But on the other hand, he's a dictator that belongs to an ethnic minority that the ethnic majority tried to exterminate and committed one of the fastest genocides in history against. So I was willing to give him quite a lot of credence when he talked about the context of his regime. That he thought that another genocide was a real possibility, and I thought it was too. And then there's also the question: well, what do you do with Hutus and Tutsis? Both peoples have tried to commit genocides against it, or have committed genocide against each other, but they do have to live together in this country. Kagame's solution is a kind of strong-arm dictatorship, and it's a reasonable solution to a problem that hellacious, even though I don't believe in dictatorship. It really just kind of upends all the neoliberal beliefs that you bring from the West to Africa. A situation like that, like none of your guidelines that you grew up with fit the situation properly anymore.
When you were there, you said that by the end of your trip, it had ground away your sanity and well-being. Why was that?
Well, just the tragedy of it, the violence, the aftermath of the genocide, and people being forced to live with the relatives, or being forced to live with the people that had killed their own relatives in the same kind of government villages. It just wore me down. That, and recurrent fevers and ill health. Yeah, I was just worn down by the end of that, by ill health, African fevers, and just the horrific thing that had happened there that people were still traumatized by.
But still safer than the Sierra Madre.
Yeah, safer than the Sierra Madre, but more traumatized.
And when it comes to a place like the Mississippi Delta, which was the last book that's been published, I know you got a new book coming out. You mentioned that I think you mentioned that you sort of got hooked into Mississippi through reading William Faulkner when you were younger, and specifically visiting Oxford, Mississippi.
Yeah, my love-hate relationship with Mississippi. Actually, I was living in Tucson, and I was driving around, and I heard this song on the radio by a guy named Junior Kimbrough, and it was this Mississippi Hill Country blues. And it's not like the Delta blues, it's not like the Chicago blues, it's like a one-chord drone, like this backcountry kind of hypnotic drone blues. And I just was crazy about it, and I bought the album. And then I found out that two white college kids had managed to get $1 million in debt recording the last of these old hill country bluesmen who were all in their 70s and 80s. And I thought to myself, well, that's got to make a magazine story. And so I drove out to Oxford and did a story on the record company Fat Possum, and interviewed some of these old blues guys, and was very taken with Mississippi, and I liked Oxford, and I made friends there. There's probably what I think is the best bookstore in America is in Oxford, Mississippi. Square Books regularly gets voted the best bookstore in America. And I just found it beguiling, and made friends there, and kept going back there. And to cut a long story short, ended up moving to Mississippi, but out in the Delta to this isolated farmhouse. And it was really kind of a desperate, plunging decision, but it worked out.
Well, I want to go into that decision, because you mentioned early on that you had met a guy in Oxford, Mississippi named Jim Myers at a party. Do you know what I'm talking about? Can you talk about what happened there?
Jim Myers, that was my first night in Oxford. There was he was a white guy from Arkansas, singer-songwriter. We were at this party, and we'd been kind of drinking together and smoking cigarettes, which I used to do in those days. And I ran out of cigarettes, and I went up to him and I said, "Hey Jim, can I bum a smoke?" And he just whipped out this rusty pocket knife and jammed it under my balls, and had like no idea why. I was like, Jim, like, what's up? And he just said, I ain't got laid in months. I was like, what's that got to do with me? And then he just folded up the pocket knife and like stomped off, and I had no idea what just happened. And I asked the guys from the record company, and they just said, "Oh, he's from Arkansas." Like that explained it.
So
Yeah,
that
that was
was
my
that was your
first
first
night
night.
in Mississippi, which is it's so cliched in a lot of ways. Um,
And you kept coming back to Oxford. I heard you had spent a summer in Water Valley in a trailer
yeah,
with a
yeah. I
bunch of
spent the
blues
summer in
guys.
Forest Valley, living in a trailer next to the Fat Possum recording studio, and so I would share that trailer with the blues artists that would come in to record or start their tours there. So I got pretty friendly with T Model Ford and a guy named Paul Wine Jones and T Model's drummer Spam, and yeah, I mean, I just Mississippi just worked its way into me. I think it's one of the most misunderstood places in America. I mean, I've written 2 books about Mississippi. There's a lot more that going on in Mississippi than most people understand.
In other words, people just sort of have this caricature in mind.
Right. They just think it's a bunch of dumb rednecks and that nothing much is happening. But I mean, to give you a couple of examples, Mississippi has produced more award-winning writers per capita than any other state in America. It's produced more Grammy award-winning musicians than any other state. It's got this incredible creative side um, that. But how? I mean, it's the poorest state. It's the worst educated state. It's the most conservative state. It's the most religious state. But it has, this incredible track record for music and literature. So it's basically everything. Everything is a contradiction in Mississippi, and it just upends all your stereotypes, all your ways of thinking.
And when you mentioned Paul Wine Jones, I had heard when you were living in Water Valley. This was right after your first marriage. What advice did Paul Jones have for you?
Well, I was, yeah, just my first marriage had just broken up, and I was pretty heartbroken. And I had these blues guys staying in the trailer with me, and they hated to see a man down because of a woman, so they would try and give me this advice to deal with my heartbreak. And yeah, T Model Ford said you got to be like the tree. It says a tree just keeps growing and growing, and he doesn't give a shit about any of those other trees around him. But when he falls down, he's gonna knock those other trees down. Like this was a triumph. Paul Wine Jones, he advised me to go to this whorehouse in Memphis where the ladies could do tricks with ping pong balls. And he said if you had enough money, that place would cure any man's blues. And then this guy Spam, who was T Model's drummer, he said I need to stay away from sporting ladies. And then he lifted up his hand, and like all his fingertips had been sliced off by this prostitute with a box cutter.
Oh my
And T
God.
Model got furious, and it's like, and you're still dating her.
I mean, it's perfect in a way. The idea that in the midst of heartbreak, you're going to live with a bunch of blues musicians. I mean, you almost couldn't write a better setup. Um,
Yeah, I
when
mean, their advice was completely worthless. I should not no help at all. But on the surface, it did seem like a neat and tidy, cool thing. But yeah, it's I mean, the culture they come out of. I mean, it's just not that different to what the original blues guys came out of. It's desperately poor. It's violent. It's dysfunctional. Um, I mean, they were tough guys. T Model we didn't really have a sweet side. He had a lot of charm, and he had like a real twinkle in his eye, but he was I mean, there was like knives getting pulled the whole time and pistols getting pulled, and I mean, it was rough.
But you didn't feel, did you feel in danger at any time?
Um, I mean, not when it was just me and them. Sometimes, I remember once in a public situation, T-Model set up on, it was like a poor black neighborhood in Water Valley, and I went with T-Model, and he set up his guitar on somebody's front porch and was playing the blues, and everyone started drinking gin, and we basically had to like flee. There were people like grabbing after our wallets and threatening us, and yeah, we all fled in T-Model's. What is it? Was it a Cadillac he had? No, it was a Lincoln. He had this big blue Lincoln Continental. There was people like scrabbling at the windows and yelling, and I did feel like things could go wrong.
I Before you officially you bought a house in the Mississippi Delta, you were living in New York with your girlfriend at the time.
Yeah.
How did you sell that? How-
Okay, so we were living in, I think it was a 425 square foot apartment, and I mean, when we arrived, I mean, the way we got to New York was through that BBC documentary. For the first time in I'd been a journalist for 20 years. I'd always been broke, but I had some money from that documentary, and I said, well, let's just go to New York and blow this, see if we can live for a year in New York just to do it. We had really good friends there, and it's capital of the world, and so we went up there, and I had like a commission from the New Yorker. I had another documentary in the works. I had like a book deal in the works, and within 3 weeks of being in New York, like the New Yorker rejected my story, like my book deal fell through, the magazine went bust that I was working for. I couldn't get any work. My wife couldn't, or my girlfriend then, she couldn't even get a job as a barista. I mean, we had nothing going on, and then I went down to Mississippi, and I found this old farmhouse for sale for $130,000, like a 5-bedroomed, lovely old farmhouse on 9 acres with fruit trees on a river and vegetable gardens, and they barely let you park in New York for that. So I drove back to New York, and I said, look, I know this sounds crazy, but I think we should leave Manhattan and move to the Mississippi Delta and live in an old farmhouse 40 minutes from the nearest grocery store in a state that you've never been before, that you've heard many bad things about. And things were just so rotten for us in New York that she was willing to come and have a look at the house. And she fell in love with the house, and the neighbors were really nice to us. And yeah, but we just didn't have. We were going to fail in New York. We needed something, we needed something to do. I was like, maybe I can get a book out of this. And so, yeah, we just kind of fled. We just fled Manhattan into this big old farmhouse, and we didn't really know what we were doing.
Okay, I mean, far be it from me to give anyone advice, and you're obviously way more successful than I am, but as a young person, I really think that you should start a podcast. I mean, because when you talked about all these, the New Yorker and the BBC and all these gatekeepers, I mean, your stories are incredible. Like, you don't need to have any money to start a podcast, and I guarantee you people would be interested in it.
Well, I haven't really thought about that. I mean, how do you get people to listen to it?
I mean, okay, so that's one thing.
You work social media like a beast.
Yeah, that definitely helps. Having, I mean, if you have writer friends that can just like tweet out, or put on their social media, hey, check out my friend's podcast. If you have writer friends that you can interview on the podcast, I mean, it's not as simple as just starting it, although
Yeah,
it is. And you could talk to your publisher. I mean, there's a lot of different avenues. Again, this is just a shot in the dark, but I'm listening to these stories. I'm like, man, I would love. There are travel podcasts out there, and they all suck. they're just like, oh, how to travel on a budget, and it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
like clean cut, and this is this is a lot more rough around the edges, and I think what people are looking for. I mean, it's just a suggestion, but I would really I would love to listen. I know
Well,
that.
maybe we could talk more about this at some other stage.
I'd be happy to, man.
I mean,
100%.
I've been knocking around for a while now. It's like you pick up stories, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, you would be perfect for this kind of thing. The Are you still living in the Mississippi Delta?
I'm not. I'm living in Jackson, Mississippi right now. My wife got a job here, and so we moved to Jackson. And I mean, it's okay, but it's not really doing it for me.
You don't strike me as the kind of guy who loves to settle down. I mean, I'm sure you're happy where you're at and with your family and everything like that. But do you ever feel the itch to get moving?
Yeah, I do. It's decided to have a child late in life because it seemed like a huge thing to miss out on, and it's been a massive adjustment. I was used to so much personal freedom to travel, and it's a big adjustment having that kind of not completely removed, but drastically curtailed. Um, no, I could see myself settling down. I just can't see myself settling down in Jackson, Mississippi.
Okay.
The church to bar ratio is just way too off for me.
I see.
I'm actually thinking about going back to the Southwest, and I lived in Tucson for a long while. My wife's from there, and her family is there, and she's got friends there. And I'm thinking about, get like a little adobe house and make a sanctuary out of your backyard, and get some hiking done, and float down some rivers, and cross the border into Mexico, and read great books, and maybe that would be a good way to spend one's 60s.
I think that sounds like a good time to me. When you were,
Fabulous tacos. I mean, that mess.
yeah, I'm out in LA and you get, I mean, I'm from
Oh
Chicago
yeah.
originally. And the Mexican food is just leaps and bounds over anything I got back home.
Really? There's so many Mexicans in Chicago there. How does that work?
Well, I mean, there's not as many hole in the walls. There's laws in at least in the city of Chicago that these food trucks can't just set up. And if you're like a Mexican family, it's a lot easier to just set up a table or a truck, and they have great food. Like there's a place just a few blocks down here. I can get you know a burrito and two tacos for $7, and it's much better than Chipotle or anything like that.
Yeah, I missed that. Actually, there's a place in Jackson you can. There's a Mexican market that I frequent. I can get my fix.
I see. Were
But
you? Sorry, go ahead.
I just, I mean, I'd just like to talk about something here.
Please.
Um, this modern world that we're all stuck in now. I feel like the last honest thing that we've got left to us is our senses,
Mm.
the sense of taste, and our ears, and it's like everything else has been colonized by marketing and technology. But so yeah, that's my plan for the future is to live through my senses as much as possible, to really savor my food and wine, and feast my eyes, and train my ears to recognize different people's footfalls, and smell the flowers.
Do you do you have any? I mean, sure there's some, but in terms of the general direction of your life, you don't regret getting not getting a 9 to 5 job or anything like that, do you?
No, no.
Okay. Do you
But
have any?
it could
Sorry.
it could have gone wrong because I didn't have health insurance for 30 years until Obama made me get some.
I see.
So that could have gone really badly wrong. Although I kept myself signed on in England, and I would go to doctors in Mexico. But I don't know, now with having a kid and a mortgage and a car payment and God knows how many insurance payments, it does feel sometimes strenuous to have to hustle your life gig by gig.
Well, that's it seems to be the direction you're talking about modern life. It's the gig economy
Yeah.
is, you know, the way things seem to be going. I guess as a journalist, have you noticed over the course of your career, it seems like it's a lot harder to make a living now as a journalist, or especially to start a career in journalism.
Yeah, I mean it does seem tough, but um I know two young photographers that have just they're doing fine, you know. I
Hmm.
still do think that the cream rises and makes it, but it is tough out there. I mean, there's just way fewer outlets, and the money was always terrible. At least throughout my career. But no, it looks tough out there now to be, especially trying to sell words.
Yeah, 100%. When your book came out for the Mississippi Delta, how did the people you lived with react?
So they were in it, and
Right.
they had been incredibly kind to us and had kind of adopted us. But we were. I mean, my wife's kind of fairly sort of normal liberal. I'm more kind of surly and independent and cynical, and don't really like either political party.
Right.
And the people that our nearest neighbors that took care of us, they were pretty normal Southern Republicans. Their TV was on Fox. Our car radio was on NPR, and I tried to write about them as honestly as possible, particularly regarding race, which was much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. And I gave the book in manuscript to them, and I kind of spent 3 days walking the floor in agony. And then I got a call from Kathy Thompson. She said, Richard, I didn't like reading some of the things you wrote about me, but they're all true. The book is wonderful. Like, go ahead and publish it as it is. And that kind of set the tone. I mean, it was the best-selling book in Mississippi for 2 years straight. I got called into the state legislature and got honored with a resolution saying this is when I got an award for being a preserver of Mississippi culture or a recorder of Mississippi culture. I mean, Mississippi loved that book, and it was not like it was a kind book, but it wasn't like a.
It wasn't hagiography.
No, by no means. I mean, like people here know the problems they have. They understand the racism and the legacy of slavery here as well as anybody does. And they would just really appreciate that I didn't make any cheap shots, that I took them seriously as as people, and I took the culture seriously, and wrote about its faults and its virtues like I would with any other culture that I would write about. They're just so used to being the butt of everybody's joke, and I didn't make any cheap shots, and I mean I didn't make fun of them, even though I hope there's some laughter to be had in the book, but it's not at their expense.
Do you think that's all that thirsting to be recognized as human beings rather than caricatures, or as you said, the butt of a joke? Um, do you think that all leads to the sympathy with some of these more conservative politicians who, at least in theory, say that they take them seriously?
Hey, don't quite understand the question.
Sure. So like when like Trump gets up and says like, oh, these people on the coasts, they don't understand you, even though he's a New Yorker, let's say.
Right.
And if I'm someone in Mississippi who it seems like a lot of people, probably myself included, don't understand them, and they feel that, and they feel that sense of ridicule, even if these people aren't improving their education systems or, um, do you kind of see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. I mean, I just read this book, American Nations, that argues that America, the reason why America can't get along is because it's made up of 11 separate nations that have basically followed the templates that were there when they were founded. And you're never going to be able to get deep Southerners to agree with Californians and Yankees. I mean, the culture is just so different. I mean, you're never going to be able to get Yankees to agree to, AR-15s all over the place, and no labor laws, and I mean, you just have to kind of, for me at least, I mean, I just realized when I got here that it was a separate nation. Just the America that I knew did not apply here, but that didn't mean that these people were worse than me or inferior to me. They were just really different to me. And I think having traveled a lot in Mexico and the Caribbean and South America and Africa, that was kind of easy for me to learn that this was just a different place. It wasn't like a worse place or a wrong place. It was just a place with its own rules, and that if I had grown up in this place, I would almost undoubtedly think the same way as these people. But I'd grown up in London, multicultural London, England in the 1970s and 1980s, and that's why I thought the way that I did. And these people had grown up in Mississippi, and that's why they thought like they did. So I was I'm not very judgmental, and I think Mississippi sort of helped instill that in me.
You have another book coming out, or at least that you had just finished recently.
Yeah, it should be out next year. It's about Natchez, Mississippi, which used to have more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in America in 1860. It was the kind of real capital of the cotton slavery economy. And these planters built these immense, grandiose mansions. But the twist in the story is that they were nearly all Unionists, and they voted against secession in the Civil War, even though they were making their money off slavery, and that they welcomed the Union generals in after surrendering to use their mansions as headquarters. So all these mansions in Natchez got preserved and are still there. And there's a kind of interesting society has formed in these mansions that involves wearing hoop skirts and impersonating the dead, very ritualistic, very drunken. And finally, having kind of spent about 70 years marketing the town as Gone with the Wind, the town is now trying to grapple with the fact that everything was built on slavery, and how are we going to remember that, and how are we going to acknowledge that. So it's a kind of microcosm of this this debate going on nationwide, like how are we going to address the legacy of slavery in this country, and Natchez is a very interesting example of that.
Well, if you've written it, I'm sure it's going to be a great book. I don't want to take up too much of your time here. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is for people who want to pursue this kind of lifestyle, or people who've got money saved up, they want to quit their jobs and travel, meet wild people, have these kind of adventures, or just get out of their bubble, I guess.
Yeah.
It sounds so romantic, but is there any practical advice you have for these people, or what would you say to someone like that?
I guess I mean, the anti-romance thing, I was just so poor the whole time, you know? No health insurance, like, I mean, I was willing to make the trade, but I was just so broke. And that, that gets to you after a while. It's fine when you're young, but I mean, thank God I can like make a bit more of a living now, but I mean, that's the downside. It's just being broke. It was kind of like a vow of poverty in a way. Thank God for the pinto bean, a 5 pound sack of pinto beans. Will keep you fed for about 20 cents a day. I guess that's a valuable piece of advice. Learn to cook pinto beans. Now, I advise a little bit of onion and garlic, a little bit of Mexican oregano, a dash of cumin. Bring them to a boil and then just let them simmer as slowly as possible. And don't rush it. And you can eat for, about 20 cents a day, and maybe put a bit of rice next to that, get a bottle of hot sauce, maybe a tortilla. But yeah, that's how I lived for 10 years, 20 years.
Wow.
Founded on the bean.
Okay, so I guess that's a good place to leave it. Learn to cook pinto beans.
Yeah. I never liked black beans as much, but I do like them too.
That'll work just as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 pound sack of pinto beans.
Well, with that, Mr. Grant, thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
All right, and you and me will talk a little more about this podcast or email.
Please.
Sounds like it could be a good idea.
I think it would be an excellent idea for you.
Okay. All right, take it easy, Duncan.
All right, you too.
All right.
Bye-bye. All right, thank you to Richard Grant, and I'm Duncan Gammy. Thank you for listening to Dunk Tank. See you next time. Thank you to Dr. John Horgan, and thanks for listening to Dunk Tank. See you next time.